Cool. So, welcome to this conversation with Greydon Square, who is a hip hop artist and founder and captain of Grand Unified, which I'm sure people will find out what that is soon if they don't already know. Um, and yeah, I recently made a video about sort of like mentions of antinatalism in your music, which you saw, and then I reached out to you and we put this together. So
Absolutely.
I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. And also, I just want to get out of the way as well straight away that I'm a big fan of your music. You know, I've been listening to you for a few years now, so this is really an honor. So I want to get that, out the way, and so you know where I'm coming from as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And before you get started, I'd like to thank all of your viewers as well. I saw a lot of the comments that people had made on your first
Mm.
video, and I was very appreciative of the kind words that was left. So thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
No, 100%, and they're fully earned as well. So actually, just so people know, and we don't leave people hanging, what is Grand Unified? That won't be like the main thing we're talking about today, but just so people aren't, just left hanging on that.
Yeah, no, it can be. No, Grand Unified Theory, we call it GU or Grand Unified for short, is a creative collective that I started with a few of my best friends about 15 years ago.
Mm.
We were, we're all rappers, and rappers got to have crews, and everyone wants to shout out their crew, and our crew was Grand Unified. What we didn't know was that GU was going to become a massive creative collective of over 1,500 members online, and
Mm.
tens of thousands of people across the world in every continent on the planet Earth, flying our flag and representing our particular ideological perspective, which has to do a lot with moving humanity forward towards something known as type 1 on the Kardashev scale, and having a net positive role in that
Mm.
ascension to that place. And so Transintellectualism, this concept that I also sort of founded, was designed and created so that it would give an ideological compass and a heading to the ultimate goal, which was ultimately to see humanity reach a level of technology where we have, you know, much more functional control about our health and about our longevity, our lifespan, our suffering, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Mm.
And for me, GU originally was this sort of small organization that has now blown up into, you know, 6 different incarnations. There's 6 different houses of Grand Unified, different types of flavors. The Unified Federation, which is a gaming org that plays Star Citizen, which I'd
Mm.
love to talk about. Um, GU has been my life's work, and I've always said that I will be remembered not for my music, but for Grand Unified. We have people now who are second generation Grand Unified members, people who have been born into and grow up in
Oh,
this
whoa.
community. Yes, we have children who have been named after me. I don't have any kids myself. It is pretty unique to be an orphan and also not have kids, because when a fan names a child after you, you have to process that emotionally.
Mm.
Now, I am no longer an orphan. I have been adopted into a wonderful family who has claimed me as theirs, and I am forever grateful and appreciative of that. But for most of my life, my perspective was that of an orphan.
Mm.
And so I carried myself that way. There's a certain type of perspective that orphans have about attachment, about, emotional vulnerability and things like that. So Grand Unified was that family that the orphan in me never had. And it allowed me to create what was essentially a extension of the desire to satisfy the family that I never really had.
Mm. Yeah, it's I have, as you know, I recently joined the GU Discord, and I was obviously aware of GU from, because you mention it in your music, fairly regularly,
Mhm.
um, but I didn't understand like the extent of it until I joined the Discord and saw how much of a community there was. And then I didn't even realize the like even further extent that you've just mentioned about, there were second generation GU members and stuff. So that's like a massive accomplishment on its own, let alone like the music on the other side. So yeah, I would encourage anyone, a lot of the people who will be watching this. I'm sure some people from GU will come and watch it, but
They will.
um, a lot of the people who will be watching will be people, who watch my videos generally, who I'm sure haven't really engaged with GU. So I'd encourage them, to go check it out and get involved if they can in whatever way. Um, what ways can people get involved if someone's like a newbie? What's like the best way for someone to engage with the community that people who are existing members would appreciate?
That's a great question. I think there's several entry points into the community, and I think they satisfy different demographics for different reasons.
Mm,
You actually brought attention to one entry point into Grand Unified, which is antinatalism, right? There are people within our ranks who subscribe to that particular ideological perspective.
mm,
And it is because they seek like-minded people to want to discuss other things with. Grand Unified is important. I think for someone coming into the community for the first time, I think introducing yourself is one of the things that it's kind of mandatory, because we want you to feel comfortable with telling us a little bit about yourself so that people can open up to you about who they are. And everybody goes through that sort of introduction process. When they come into our community, we have so many different topics that we talk about, from, futurism to pro wrestling to horticulture and organic lifestyle and living. People who are really into fitness, people who are really into music, people who are really into art. We have a lot of, graphic artists and people who are very much into visual art.
mm.
A lot of us are science fiction fans. We grew up on Star Trek and Star Wars and Stargate and Battlestar, anything with a star in it. But those things we grew up on, and so most of the community are people who are Trekkies. I go to Star Trek conventions and wear a uniform and walk around like an idiot. There are people who within this community would only feel comfortable doing that within the borders of Grand
Yeah.
Unified Theory. And we try to make people feel comfortable enough. We don't tolerate any type of toxic behavior and stuff like that. But we do allow people to, express themselves in the way that they would like to express themselves be it through art or through other things within the community. And I just think it's getting amongst our ranks and then just kind of normal conversational sort of things. However, I will say that a lot of people on the internet, just because of the nature of the world today and how technologically dependent it is, people are on technology. I feel like a lot of people have trouble in online communities because there are contexts of communication that gets lost in text.
Mm,
So a lot of times we do voice chats, and we have people who jump in the voice channels and hang out, and those voice channels have video option. So people will turn their video on. And so now you're actually seeing the
yeah.
people that you're interacting with. You're talking to those people. You're seeing their body mannerisms. You're seeing if their mood's a little down today, or if they're a little upbeat. Maybe you can ask, "Hey man, you all right, man? You look a little down today. What's up?" We have women in our community. We have trans in our community. Every type of quote unquote minority you can think of. We have all types of belief systems. There are theists within our ranks, even though we're primarily a secular sort of atheistic
Mm,
group. But we don't frown on people's religious belief if they're respectful about it, and they're not trying to proselytize to us
yeah.
ultimately. But I don't. come on in. You want to talk? Let's talk. There are places. We have a philosophy channel that we, talk about deep philosophical stuff in, and other mind expanding channels. I'll leave it at that. But there's a lot of brain food there, and
Yeah.
we are a community of intellectuals. So that tends to come in the 6 flavors of Grand Unified that people are in the community are most familiar with, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, and you were saying that one of the entry points is antinatalism, and there's at least some sort of, I'm assuming, minority of people in GU that are antinatalist. So like
mhm.
when you, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think was the first mentions of antinatalism in your music in Compton Scattering, or had it been before?
Yes.
It was
Well,
the first.
officially by name, yes. I think what had happened was, I had for a long time felt a lot of the feelings that I vocalized in that song, and if I had a
Mm,
choice, I had felt a lot of those ways for most of my life because of the amount of abuse that I went through as a child in the system. And I felt like if I would have had a choice to come here to a family that essentially had abandoned me, a mother who had essentially abandoned me to the system, um, and a father who was too dysfunctional to be a father, um, then I wouldn't have come here.
mm,
Given a choice, I wouldn't have come here. And so I've always wrestled with the concept of like, do we choose this type of existence? Do we choose this sort of experience, and for what purpose would we choose it? um I'm not a quote unquote spiritual type person in the sense of, I think there's someone behind the scenes working the levers, but I do often consider the possibility that there was some realm before this in which this was given to me as a choice
mm,
to experience, and I chose yes. My question is why? And to me, antinatalism allows me to play with some of those thoughts. And the minority contingent of antinatalists within GU, those were people in a lot of ways that, found me through them discovering antinatalism, and found this song that I had did,
yeah.
and came into the community through that way. So, yes, I would say that there are people within the antinatalist community who fall within our ranks as well.
And what was the reaction like from GU when you sort of spoke more explicitly about antinatalism in your lyrics? Because, you know, I think in the video that I did that you reacted to, um, I sometimes referred to the fact that I said like Greydon wasn't resistant to this idea or something like that, and you sort of made the point of like, well, no, I'll listen to anyone's ideas and I'll consider it, and that the reason I framed it like that was not because I thought you specifically would be resistant, but it's that the idea, like, it makes contact with so much resistance. The vast majority of people that come into contact with this idea are very resistant to it, whether that be because they feel personally attacked because they have had a child themselves, which for me really misses the point. That the judgment of the person is really not as important as understanding the ethical sort of point that's being made, if you get what I mean. It's not,
I totally get it.
for me, it's not supposed to be a blame game. It's supposed to be about us together having a discussion about ethics and what is the way that we should live our lives where we cause the least harm. And I think antinatalism makes an important contribution to that, but unfortunately it's one that doesn't really get a hearing by many people. So that's sort of why I framed it like that. And I didn't know what the reaction was that you got when you released that album and those songs in it.
So before I answer your question directly, let me frame it a little bit by saying, you know, due to, I think, the experiences that I had growing up in the system, and just being an orphan growing up, I will say something that's indicative of me that may not be to most antinatalists. So I just want
Mm,
to preface what I'm about to say, that this is not all antinatalists, and I don't believe that this is how all antinatalists think. This is something very specific to my experience. I believe that I am broken in a way that allows me to see the value in antinatalism without being wrapped up in the emotional baggage of desiring to have kids myself,
Mm.
or being born into a pretty dysfunctional circumstance. And that is because when I talk to people about their kids, there is a physiological reaction that takes place because we're evolutionarily designed to feel that way about our offspring. It justifies and satisfies the desire to survive, and thus procreation gives us, the populace of humanity that we have. But I do feel like when I talk to people about kids in general, not even the concept of not having them to prevent suffering,
Mm.
but just the concept of kids in general, people have and this is expected because this is the type of beings that we are, a very visceral reaction towards these sort of topics and anything involving kids. Some people reinforce that by also then thinking that their value is derived from how much they put into their kids, and then that reinforces the idea of like not even considering a world where their kid's not here.
Mm.
But to your more immediate question of how was the reaction, I think it was mixed. There were a lot of people who disagreed with me writing that song and felt sad that I wrote it. I wrote that song coming out of a relationship, and a relationship that was ending, where I thought that the person that I was with, I was going to have a family with. And this had a lot to do with the fact that, I desired a family because I had never had one.
Mm.
But that was also unfair to put that type of pressure on that person, because they didn't grow up under those same circumstances. They grew up under completely different circumstances. So their desire to be in that circumstance with me was probably not as high as mine was for them. And I had to recognize that and separate myself and go my own way.
Mm.
Um, the reaction within the community, I felt like it was very mixed, and a lot of people reached out, and rightfully so, thought that I was not in the best of places mentally and psychologically, and I wasn't. Today, I am much more able to look at it objectively and dispassionately as just a matter of logical philosophical discussion, as
Mm.
opposed to back then, where I kind of used it as a way to cope with the fact that I just simply wasn't going to have kids, and that just wasn't going to be an option for me. And so as I got older and understood the kind of value in the argument itself, I think existentially, of course, it makes sense. But for many people who not only desire to have kids, but have already had kids, there's a physiological, visceral repulsion to the concept, the very notion of antinatalism.
Mm. Yeah, you were talking about how, you were coming from one sort of perspective or one situation when you actually wrote the song, but now you sort of see it as more of a philosophical, intellectual sort of from an emotional distance, maybe is a
Hmm.
good way of putting it.
Yeah,
And it reminds me of a quote by, do you know Emil Sharon?
I do not.
So he is not alive anymore. He was, I'm pretty sure, Romanian, and he wrote a book which was basically like it was a collection of notes. It wasn't like one coherent sort of book that you read all the way through. It's sort of broken up into these thoughts basically, and one of the quotes that I learned of his, which I really resonated with from an antinatalist perspective, is "I do not hate life or desire death. I only regret being born."
Hmm.
Which for me really encapsulates it, because I also kind of have this emotional distance from the idea of antinatalism, because for me it doesn't come from this place of like lamenting the fact I was born or lamenting my own life, but I just understand, for me it's just an intellectual or philosophical thing of I realize that it would have been better if the whole thing weren't started. But now I'm here, I might as well have as good a time as I can, try and help others, but I don't have that active lament over the fact that I was born, if you get what I mean.
I do. But what if we, instead of using both of our framings as a reference
Mm,
point, what if we go one layer up? What if we scale one layer up and we say, what if it's not just our particular lives that we felt like, well, given a choice to come into reality? Me personally, I tell people this all the time. I would not have come here, not to Earth, and I wouldn't have come here into this universe given the circumstances of what this universe actually is.
yeah.
I would not have chosen that. Now, maybe other people would, and that's fine. But if we scale one layer up, I tend to look at it from a universal, a multiversal, and perhaps even an omniversal perspective. You see, I struggle with something that I'm sure the great thinkers of history have all struggled with. And it is, and I'll ask you this, the greatest question of all time. What do you believe the greatest question of all time is?
Uh, it's either going to be why are we here, or how comes there's something rather than nothing.
There you go. Second one. Boom.
Okay.
And I believe that is probably the consensus greatest question of all time. Why
Yeah.
is there something rather than nothing? And I think, and I'm sure people will take this and probably, think that this is pretty harsh, but I think it's not just life. I think reality in general would have been better off if there was nothingness as
Mm,
opposed to reality. If the opposite of reality is null, and the concept of non-existence in general throughout the totality of what isn't reality,
mm.
then ultimately it is not just my life I'm talking about. I'm talking about all life and all of existence.
And why? Because I I fully get what you mean about life, right? So I too think that it would be better if life just hadn't, wasn't here, hadn't evolved, right? But what's the issue you see with, say, just if it was just like a barren universe, there would, say just Earth was Mars, there was
And you're saying that that was the condition throughout all of the known universe.
yeah. So there's no life in the universe. It's essentially just space rocks floating around.
I mean, then it's just a matter of like I guess a waste of
Mm,
potentiality. But
mm,
even that is what we're probably discussing here. You know, what is the potentiality of life? What is the greatest possible circumstance? What is the worst possible circumstance? Now, if you're a religious person, that varies, right? Because, if the greatest possible scenario is heaven and the worst is hell, then, that's a lot different than the way I see the world.
yeah, yeah.
I will say that the worst possible scenario is some sort of, horrible subjugation or torture for the entirety of your life where you know only suffering and at the expense of other people. Um, and the best possible version of that is possibly you gain all of the potential wealth and adulation of your species. Those two things, in my opinion, don't weigh the same.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
question is, what do you believe weighs more?
yeah. Have you ever heard of the story "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas"?
I have not. It sounds amazing though.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting short story. It's literally only like 2 or 3 pages, written by this woman, Ursula K. Le Guin, who I think she's known for some other book which was really famous, which I'm embarrassing myself by not knowing. But anyway, she also wrote this short story which um, has so many applications in philosophy and ethics, and it's also it has relevance to antinatalism. So the basic idea is that there's this city called Omelas where everything is perfect. People have, festivals and celebrations every day. Everyone has a good standard of living, a good quality of life. You know, you walk around the town, the city, everyone has a smile on their face. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with this place. Um, but the existence of this city is dependent on a basement beneath the city where there's one child who is just locked in a dark room in their own filth and just suffers. And it's that suffering. She doesn't explain why, but you sort of have to you assume that there is a connection, or you assume it for the story. Um, the only way that that city and all its wealth and joy can exist is because that child is suffering. And the ones who walk away from Omelas are the people who, everyone in the city is aware of this, knows the child is suffering, and that's why they can enjoy the lives they can enjoy. And some of them, or most of them, decide to stay and just turn a blind eye. But some of them, the ones who walk away from Omelas, decide to leave Omelas and say, actually, you know what? I don't want my joy to be coming from this suffering child, because I wouldn't be able to live with myself. And that it's often used by people in the discussion of ethics, because they say, this is an example of how, the good lives clearly massively outweigh the one bad life in terms of numbers. But the suffering is so much more important, which is why our attention is drawn to it and why we care about it so much more. What do you think about that story?
I'm going to start from the end of your statement and kind of work backwards, because I think there's something we have to kind of admit to ourselves as intellectuals that is kind of uncomfortable in this realm of discussion, which is the way we perceive morals is somewhat relative based on our path to this point as quote unquote top of the food chain here. A lot of beings suffer simply because we exist.
Yeah.
The amount of suffering probably couldn't be calculated, quantifiable. But I do think that when we talk about how we judge suffering and how we would judge if this particular theoretic scenario was playing out, where you have one child suffering, paying for the pleasure of this entire city populace. I'm a big Star Trek fan. A lot of people know that I'm a big Trekkie. And there's an old Vulcan proverb that say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. However, in this situation, I'm sure Mr. Spock would probably disagree, because the person who is suffering did not have a say in their potential to avoid said suffering. They just are. And in that, I believe that's an immoral circumstance, and thus outweighs the numerical advantage of mob rule and saying, oh, well, we all feel good about this. Who cares if that one kid is suffering? So I think that's the first thing that I'll have to acknowledge in this, is that I am speaking from a morally relativistic place. I know a lot of theists probably don't like that, and I'm sure it's not the cutest, cleanest thing to say. But I have to say that because, there's a lot of suffering in nature in general, and the judgment of beings that create suffering in nature is often dismissed because they're just animals. Well, guess what? We're animals too. We're just very, very intellectual ones, highly sophisticated ones, but we are animals. And so the amount of suffering that we have conditioned ourselves to ignore is based on the amount of suffering we evolved in. And there's really no avoiding that, because existence inherently is suffering, which is what comes all the way back to this whole antinatalism position in the first place. If you can prevent the thing you tell me you love the most in all of reality, your child, from the potentiality of, suffering and an immense amount of suffering and just unfortunate circumstance in their life. If you were to tell me, hey, the child you have is going to be eaten alive by bears one day, or you can choose to not have them. If you have them, that is the eventuality. There's no way off this road. There's no exits, no off ramps. That is the ultimate eventuality. You can take that, or you can say, I'm not going to have any kids, because that particular outcome, that eventuality, is not something I'm willing to risk as a certainty. And so people take very different calculated risks in their life. I know daredevils. I know people who do a lot of risky stuff. And one of the most riskiest things, in my opinion, and we can get into the reasons why, is creating life. And because of that, I think, when we look at the risks that people take, they're, obviously they're rooted in sort of, the evolutionary psychology of risk reward assessment, right? And being risk averse and whatnot. But I just feel like the amount of potential in the suffering itself would make me rethink if I knew that was a possibility for my kid or my offspring or whatever existence that I was experiencing, where I had to consider that.
Mm. Yeah, and i- it's like you were saying, there's a lot of risk that comes with the act of creating someone because, ultimately, even though a lot of people say, well, I have a good life, I have, maybe I live in like a middle class area or something like that. Ultimately, none of us know how our offspring's life is going to turn out. There are countless examples of celebrities who have access to all the resources you could ever want, and yet maybe they're driven to suicide, or it turns out that they're actually not living a happy existence. So even in the situations where someone has the access to the most resources that you can want, it's still not guaranteed that they're going to have a life that is, you know um even as they see it, worth starting, if you get what I mean. And
There's plenty. I don't mean to cut you off, but there's
yeah.
plenty of empty wealthy people out there.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And it's like the way I see it with the Omelas story is every time we create a new generation, we're creating a new Omelas, because there's always going to be winners and losers. Even if they're a minority, there are going to be those people who maybe they just, they have cluster headaches, or they have chronic depression, or maybe they are in an accident early on in life, and it leaves them with lasting chronic pain or something like that. There's always going to be these people in each generation. And is it worth creating them and forcing them to endure that for the joys that all of the other people in the generation are gonna experience, if you get what I mean? um yeah, and when
So
I yeah, go on.
go ahead. No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I finished.
So I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. Number one, I'm always a fan of scaling one layer up. So let's do it again. Let's assume that the circumstances that you talked about, they don't end with death. I think one of
Yeah.
the craziest things about sort of antinatalism is it makes no statement on whether you think that this is a created or constructed life or not.
Mm.
It really doesn't have anything to say about that. And because of that, you have to add that factor, that variable in to the processing of this particular idea. Because if I'm created by a being and that being has control over life and death, and after death will judge me, and if I am judged unworthy or unsaved or whatever, then I get to go to a place of eternal torment
Yeah.
because I didn't accept that being. Let's say I'm not correct about Judeo-Christian theology, and that is the right religion, right? Let's just assume that that's the case. So now I bring a child into the world. They could have chronic pain like you're talked about because of something that happened in their life. But if they die and they go to a heaven, then that's all great, because now they have this sort of eternal pleasure sort of paradise situation. But I'm also introducing them into a situation where they could enter hell and they could
Mm.
experience eternal, everlasting torment. Now, my decisions are my own. If I choose not to accept the Jesus and the Muhammad or whoever people, okay, that's my choice. I can be punished based on my choice, even though this God made me with the perspective to choose my choice.
Yeah,
That's a whole other question.
yeah.
But it's my choice to make.
Yeah.
It wasn't my kid's choice to come here and then have to face those circumstances. I
Mm.
decided for them. That to me is an immoral act. To present your offspring with the eventuality of something eternal, which is by definition is infinite, an infinite amount of suffering. Yeah, is it possible there could be an infinite amount of pleasure? I guess if that's what you describe heaven as. I always thought heaven was described as a place where everyone just goes and worships God. Never knew it was about just pleasure.
Mm.
Thought it was about his glory and worshiping and adulation to it. And if you don't do that, then you get sent to the bad place. Well, I would rather not bring my kids into a reality where that being has the ability to make that decision for them.
Yeah,
So
100%. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, you're good.
So a friend and I actually have you ever heard of Speaker's Corner?
I haven't. Sounds good though.
So in London we have there's a park in central London called Hyde Park, and one of the northeast corner of it there's this place called Speaker's Corner, which I don't know how long it's been a thing, but it's basically just a corner of the park where there's a tradition of just open free speech. Anyone can go there. It's usually on a Sunday, but nowadays, like, people go any day. And you can just go there with a sign or a box and stand on it and start just saying what you want to say. And you get, I mean, nowadays it's more dominated by Muslim apologists, but you do get a widespread of views there. You get people talking about all sorts of issues, and it's an open forum for people to debate, basically. So you go there with your message, whatever it may be, but you have to be open to discussing and debating those ideas with people who will come up to you, because it's an environment that encourages, bring your message here, be open to criticism. Other people listen to this person and have a debate with them, have a discussion. It's this sort of it's supposed to be this open forum of the discussion of ideas of basically anything, really. And myself and a friend and some others have been a couple of times to hold signs with messages that sort of have like suggestions or explicitly antinatalist messaging on. And because I was just saying before, at the moment, a lot of the people there are Muslims, so a lot of the conversations you have are sort of within that context. And so last time we were there, we specifically wanted to talk to some Muslims about, well, what if your child will end up in the hellfire? Because that seems like, from their point of view, they have an even stronger reason to be antinatalist or to not have children. Because if someone is an atheist, or they just don't believe in an afterlife, if they create someone, they're exposing them to the risks and the harms that are in this life. But if you believe in an afterlife, in your mind, and it's an afterlife that contains something like hell, then in your mind, you're putting your child at the risk of that as well.
Yep.
And to me, it just seems bizarre. I mean, even if there was the smallest risk of me creating someone and them going to hell for eternity, I would just play it safe. But
Right.
the people we were talking to there, it just doesn't seem like they're making real contact in their minds with the suffering that they are gambling on their child, if you get what I mean. Because I can't see how someone can make real contact with that in their mind and still choose to put someone they say they love into a situation where they could end up there. And then if you layer on top of that the whole idea of, I don't know what your opinions are on free will, but if you then layer on top of that determinism, and that there's no free will, well, then you're just signing someone up to go essentially on a railway track straight to hell, and there's no other way that they could have behaved. But that obviously depends on your view of free will as well.
Yeah. Not, I don't want to get too sidetracked.
Yeah.
However, that is a conversation that we could always go into. I think, first, let me go back to the Speaker's Corner example, because, there is something I feel somewhat strongly about, which is discussion and debate, right? But I also feel like, in order to really have an effective discussion or debate, the people debating must have a certain level of emotional intelligence as well as regular intelligence. And if you don't, you run into a lot of people who, they aren't arguing from a good faith position. They have no intention of really hearing you out, only using you as a prop to further try to propagate and proselytize their ideas. Now, people are free to do that. Who am I to fucking judge? But wait, can I cuss on here?
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay. Well, who am I to judge? But like at the end of the day, I also feel like there are, so many ways that I think people think and logic to different conclusions in different ways.
Mm.
I like the example of like playing a sport, right? So, you know, have you ever played basketball? Did you ever play basketball at all?
Well, not properly, just fucking around in the playground sometimes when
Okay,
I was in school. Yeah.
perfect example, right? Everybody has a jump shot, right? Everybody can shoot the ball, but not one jump shot on that playground is going to be identical to another.
Yeah.
Correct? Think about it in terms of the way people logic and reason. Everyone can logic and reason. Not everyone's going to have the same logic and reasoning capacities to where they are actually aware they are not making logical sense. And that's fine because, again, for people with certain belief structures kind of pre-built in, your logic is dependent on that culture and that belief system. And if God says 1 + 1 = 3, then 1 + 1 = 3. That is logic for them. So I have to understand that the way that we think about things in terms of, okay, logically, why would you put something that you care so much about in the line of hellfire when you can just simply avoid that and take your chances on your own? Like, you didn't have a choice. The fact that this is the thing that makes gods so ridiculous to me, because they're so short-sighted, they seem almost human. They have this thing where an intellect that is so far superior to mine can probably reason out the fact that I didn't have a choice to come into existence. So punishing me for not doing what you wanted me to do, even though you could have popped in at any moment and just told me what it was.
Yeah.
The fact that you are now trying to act as some sort of a divine arbiter of justice, I think even that intellect would see that as kind of foolish. Now, if you're just a evil god because that's the way the reality is, hey, fine, no problem. You can throw people in hell however you want. You can torture people however you want. Just don't expect respect and adulation from me as one of the created to experience suffering. Now, if that's what you believe that I should do or other people should do, that's your business. But I wouldn't worship a god like that. And I damn sure wouldn't worship a god that knew the outcome, didn't give people a choice to come here, and then punished them for that anyway. Seems human. That seems like a human. That doesn't seem like a god. But,
Yeah.
you know, what do I know?
Yeah. And I also, because, so like, I think it's kind of been present in what we've just been talking about for the past 10 minutes, but I kind of want to explicitly say it for anyone that maybe is watching that hasn't picked up on it. Because like, personally, I think antinatalism presents a new aspect to the problem of evil critique of certain religions. Because, you can, a god can, people can say like, once we're here, our suffering is our choice, which I think is an ignorant way of viewing suffering. But some people say that they say we have free will, this sort of thing, and so we can decide who we cause harm to or who we accept harm from. But I think antinatalism really gets at the fact of like, well, just the fact of like just putting us here, right? Without, just putting someone in a situation where they can be harmed, and especially in a situation they can be harmed by a significant degree or eternally, that just in itself, starting that train off out of the station seems like an immoral thing to do, let alone what happens when you're down the tracks, if you get what I mean.
Well, for sure. I mean, to your point, if it is wrong to kill me in the womb when I don't have a choice, according to those beliefs, then in my opinion, it's just as wrong to bring me into reality without my consent. Like, I didn't ask to be killed while I was alive. I didn't ask to be born while I was non-existent. I didn't ask to come here. That's my whole thing to whatever being that exists. I didn't ask to come here. Fuck you and your rules. I don't give a fuck. I didn't ask to come here. So you can keep your Jesus and your Qurans and your rules and your bullshit. Because most of the people who suffer didn't ask to be here. In my opinion, the only being worthy of hell is the one who creates it.
Yeah.
So he can kiss my ass.
Yeah, 100%. I wanted to talk as well about something that you've spoken about a lot, which is, well, actually, you often talk about transintellectualism, but I assume that you also talk about transhumanism as well, right?
Well, transintellectualism is something that I created. Transhumanism is something I didn't. So,
Yeah. So
you know.
can you what can you for because I understand, well, I have an understanding of what transhumanism is, and I have less of an understanding, definitely less of an understanding than you, of what transintellectualism is. But are you able to explain the difference between those two things?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I don't even think really one is related to the other. You know, transhumanism is something I'm very interested in, and something I've spent a lot of time researching, just because of
Mm,
the nature of the consequences that transhumanism come out of, which is a technological singularity. I think where a lot of people are interested in transhumanism is where it intersects into technology and what abilities and things you would get from what would people would consider as high technology.
yeah.
Um, there are a lot of, let's say, Kurzweilian predictions about what would happen in a post singularity society.
What's
Uh,
Curls Wally? And you're going to have to explain that to me.
So Ray Kurzweil, I don't know if you ever heard of Ray Kurzweil, but he's an inventor. He was a philosopher. He still is. I'm talking about him like he's dead. He's still alive. Um, shout out to Ray Kurzweil, who's still with us. But yeah, no, he was a person who, he really made his bones, his legacy in the creation of technology. But he became somewhat of a household name when he got involved in ultimately this sort of fringe scientific concept known as the technological singularity. And for those
Mm,
people who don't know what the singularity is, it's basically a time where technology reaches a point that allows for things like artificial intelligence to reach such a point where an AGI can create a super intellect and thus have this intellect explosion of a sentient intellect that is now creating faster and better than humans ever could. It would be smarter than the collective species of all of humanity, able to solve the trivial things like cancer and life and death and,
mm,
what is the meaning and, just trivial things like that. Right. And I think, with the singularity came people like Ray Kurzweil, who, was almost somewhat of a techno prophet, someone who predicted that the singularity was near, that it would happen in 2029 or 2024 or 2032. But when it happened, it would change humanity as we know it. And transhumanists tend to fall into this sort of line of, propagating and pushing towards the technological singularity,
mm,
which, whether that happens or not, I'm not really a proponent for or against. If it's an eventuality of the path that we're on, so be it. If it's not, I'm not going to push towards it because I don't think humanity is really ready for it anyway.
mm,
But having said that, I think transhumanism is directly related to technology and its impact on humans to address things like life and death and sickness and creating a post-human circumstance for humans to hopefully have a choice to go into. Transintellectualism is fundamentally a construct of my ideology and what I wanted the group of grand unified theory to have as an ideological heading, which
mm,
was on the Kardashev scale, there are, type 1, type 2, type 3. Well, at type 1, we're a planetary type species. Most of the things and people can criticize that there is a bit of a kind of a globalist slant to this, which that's fair, right? But humanity tends to be a planetary species in a type 1 scenario. And things that are a benefit in a type 1 scenario is like, oh, we can control weather. We can control that this hurricane is going to hit our coast and make sure it doesn't. Or, we have predictors of tectonic plate shifting to such accuracy that we can predict earthquakes and never be affected by them ever again. There are volcanoes that possibly could erupt, super volcanoes that we now have the technological capacity to prevent. Things like that would come in a type 1 sort of world. Type 2 would be more of a stellar sort of society, a society that has now kind of become wholly dependent on their host star for most of their energetic needs, as it now becomes less economical to create an energy grid that's based on, electricity that we create in power plants, and just use the, now what I'm referring to is this sort of high efficiency photoreceptors for solar processing and powering and stuff like that. That would be at type 2. And then at type 3, you're getting into the galactic sort of level of technological engineering. So transintellectualism is the ideological perspective of choosing type 1 as a heading and trying to provide a net positive in order to achieve that. I'm not saying everything that would come with a global society would be great, but I think the net positive would be good based on where we are in society. If you really want to kind of know where we are on the scale, we're about 0.77, 0.71, 0.72 on the scale. So we're not even type 1, like we're not even really close. But there is an element of the human race, particularly people within Grand Unified, which, because I have articulated type 1 to at least be better than where we are right now, that's the direction they and I would like to head technologically and as a species. So that's what transintellectualism is compared to transhumanism, which I feel like is a completely sort of different train of thought.
Yeah. No, I get what you mean. So the reason I wanted to talk about this was because I'm going to link it to antinatalism soon. But the first thing I wanted to touch on is what do you think about the I guess it's not a criticism specifically about pursuing like pursuing like a society that moves up the Kardashev scale, but it's a general criticism of leaving Earth, which obviously we already have done with the moon and obviously space station, but there's this at least in sort of the I don't know if you've heard the term like suffering focused ethics, but there's obviously like ethics, everyone knows ethics, but within ethics there's a group. It tends to be like relatively small group of people who have formed this community called like the suffering focused ethics community, where they sort of put the primal effort should be on avoiding and reducing suffering. And there's a real concern in this community about humanity's efforts to leave Earth. And the way I see it is just fundamentally humans' capacity to develop technology always seems to be far ahead of our moral development and our ability to use that technology responsibly. Nuclear weapons is maybe a classic example of like we suddenly gained this massive capacity essentially to destroy ourselves, and yet we didn't seem to have the moral development. We didn't seem to have the sufficient moral development to use those technologies responsibly, if responsibly using a technology like that even exists, if you get what I mean. Because there have been multiple times when we nearly have entered a nuclear war because of an error in the chain of command or some signal from a on a radar or something like this, and a lot of people inside the suffering focused ethics community are concerned that when humans leave Earth, we will essentially take suffering to a whole new level, especially if we things like if exo wombs are something that happens, and we can sort of breed populations of humans on other planets, but not needing the traditional form of reproduction, or if we terraform other planets and we introduce wild animal suffering there. Because a lot of people have a very rosy view of nature, or at least a removed view of nature,
Who has a
and don't.
rosy view of nature?
Oh, a lot of. I mean, have a lot of the efforts in the environmental movement at the moment for like rewilding or restoring the earth back to its natural sort of, often humans are often referred to as like a disease on this planet or a cancer on the planet, and
Mm-hmm.
if humans could just go away, then earth would be returned to its natural beauty, etc. This sort of narrative seems to really not appreciate the level of suffering that goes on in the natural world. Just the process of evolution itself is an incredibly brutal process for the individuals, in it. And so there's this concern that we will take forms of suffering like this to other planets. What do you think about that? This sort of reservation of leaving the planet.
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and as a Trekkie, obviously, I desire to sit in the captain's chair and command my starship and go explore strange new worlds and seek out new civilizations and
Yeah.
blah blah blah. But to your point, I do think that there is the inherent risk of taking the suffering of humanity with us wherever we go, because wherever we go, there we are, and we are essentially beings of suffering. But I think we are putting the cart before the horse, because there's another aspect about this, and this is kind of a hot take, but my cynicism won't really allow me not to say it, which is for the people in the what did you call it, the ethics based,
suffering focused ethics.
Suffering focus. So for those who have that particular focus, unfortunately, I would have to ask those people, like, are you willing to commit suffering to prevent suffering? If you knew you had to commit a certain level of amount of suffering to prevent more suffering overall, would you do it? Because there are a lot of people who say, if I had $1 billion, I would do this. If I was president, I would do this. If I had the power, I would do this. But you know what it takes to have power? It takes a level of ruthless aggression and focus in order to obtain, in most cases, a level of absolute power to then decide, I am going to eliminate X, Y, or Z. If X, Y, and Z is suffering, if you knew there was a mantle that allowed you to have one wish, and that in that one wish you could eliminate all suffering from reality, would you not fight as hard as you possibly could to get that mantle if you knew it was possible? No question. It's absolutely possible. Most people would fight tooth and nail to do that, in my opinion. But because we know there's no magical solution to end all suffering, even the people in the, ethics focus community, a lot of those people would have to do things that would give them the power to make those sort of decisions. Because it's one thing to be able to say, I'm against suffering, but I have no power to change it. It's another thing to say I'm against suffering and I have actual power to be able to change that. But in order to get that power, you got to be willing to get just as dirty as the people inflicting the suffering, because ultimately they're already numb to it.
So do you think that pursuing or like traveling up the Kardashev scale will eventually get us the capacity to eradicate suffering?
With respect to your question, I don't believe there is an eradication of suffering unless you eradicate existence altogether. So our job, in my opinion, should not be to eliminate all suffering. It is to mitigate and limit the suffering that we have a hand in. But you kind of get into the sort of prime directive of interfering in species that are lower on the scale than you and deciding for them what their destiny is going to be. So if there are a pack of wild dogs on the plains and they come across elk and they want to tear this elk apart for a meal, are they morally wrong for causing the suffering during that tearing that animal apart? Are we judging them the same way we judge us? Or is it a virtue signal for us to judge us in this way because we don't want to feel guilty about the suffering we cause every single day?
Mm.
I think a lot of antinatalists are using the ideology as a way to cope with the fact that they cause suffering.
Mm.
And so they wish that they could have not been here so they don't cause suffering, which I understand.
So there's there's one more thing, because I know I've had you for about an hour now, and I want to respect your time.
You can have me. You can have me for as long as you need me.
Oh, that's amazing. Because there is another topic which I want to talk to you about, which kind of fits into what you were just saying, and you also kind of referenced that same sentiment earlier. But before we get on to that, I wanted to ask if you've ever heard of David Pearce.
David Pearce. I don't think so. I mean, maybe I have. You'd have to.
No. So he is a transhumanist philosopher, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was sort of, because transhumanism, it seems to be fundamentally about sort of breaking out of humanity's natural capacities for intelligence or happiness or longevity, these sorts of things.
Yeah, augmenting the human condition.
Yeah. And I'm guessing like different transhumanists will have their different sort of wheelhouse. So some of them will focus on trying to extend longevity to get to super longevity, and others will focus on super intelligence and things like this. And he focuses on trying to achieve super happiness. And he wrote this, I guess it's like a manifesto called the Hedonistic Imperative. And he also talks about, the abolitionist project. And what he means by that is abolishing suffering. And he essentially is trying to encourage a movement in the direction, because he's actually an antinatalist as well. Like, he thinks we shouldn't be bringing people here, and he thinks it's wrong to. And a lot of harm is done by doing that. But he also recognizes that is not a message that most people are going to like. And it's not really going to be one that's going to win out. And so people are going to continue to reproduce, and humanity is probably going to have a long future unless we sort of blow ourselves up. And so he takes the approach of, well, rather than try and advocate people not have children, why don't we focus on trying to essentially make suffering as little a problem as possible? And after this, I can send you some links to like talks he's done and stuff.
Well,
because
I was going to ask you this question in that. I don't want to lose this question, but let's say we eliminate suffering in all of humans, right? Do we then go into other species and try to decide for them?
That's his that's the view that he has. Yeah. So he thinks that we should essentially entirely abolish suffering. And he says that because suffering, once you're here, it does actually have some instrumental use. You put your hand on a hot stove, ouch, you take it away. It's a signaling mechanism, right? Not all forms of suffering, but it was evolved so to help us navigate our environment, which is still unfortunate because it's still suffering. But evolution doesn't care about our quality of life; it just cares about whether we reproduce. And he says that we can swap out the sort of information sensitive part of suffering, which is the part that is we use it as a tool, for information sensitive gradients of bliss, basically. That all we feel is experience above what he calls hedonic zero. So only positive experience, but they're experiences that convey the same information that suffering would, in terms of, I need to avoid this danger or something like that. Now, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of his proposal and how it's being pursued, you'll have to watch a couple of his talks and stuff. And actually, myself and a friend hosted the world's first online antinatalist conference a couple of months ago,
Mm-hmm.
and he spoke at it as presenting an alternative view to antinatalism. Essentially, ignore the fact people are having children like it's going to happen. Let's focus on trying to abolish suffering rather than trying to get people to stop having kids. And I think, whilst I may not agree with everything David Pearce says, I find him a really valuable voice. And I'm really glad that he's in transhumanist spaces, because I think a focus on, even if we can't abolish, but massively reducing suffering seems to be like the most pressing thing. But what are your general thoughts on what I've just said?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think there's a lot to unpack in the context of someone who wants to abolish, all of suffering in the context of moving even past his, biological lines into other species and choosing that for them. I go back to this position of, better never to have been, right? Like this idea of that just pushes the ball back. That just pushes it one layer back, but there's still a level of suffering that exists somewhere out there somewhere. And the only way that cannot exist is, and this is going to sound like a straight up supervillain statement, but the best way to address that is to literally destroy all of reality.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that that's even a possibility. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And if I had the button to do it, I probably wouldn't. If it's between me and just saying taking myself off this planet, and if people want to choose to be here, to choose to face their suffering, who am I to take that choice from them? So I would remove myself in that circumstance, this theoretical circumstance that I'm talking about. But again, to minimize as much suffering as you can within your own sort of influence in life, I think that is a net positive. And I think most people should achieve or should strive to achieve that. But when you start talking about on the existential scale, on the universal scale, on the multiversal or omniversal scale, depending on which sort of starting point of reality you want to begin at, I just feel like the buck stops with existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? If there is something, the potentiality for suffering exists. And therefore, the only way to address that at the root level is to attack existence itself. And that's not something we can do. Maybe it is something we can do. Maybe there are antinatalists who feel like if they had the technology, they would cancel out existence, because existence has just far too much suffering.
So the last sort of like big topic I wanted to talk to you about, and I don't think I've never heard it referenced in any of your lyrics, but I might have missed them. And it relates to a couple of things we've already talked about. It relates to, as you were saying, like all of us, just by existing, we cause harm. And also you referencing, sort of, there's a boundary we overstep when we interfere with the lives of other animals, other species, because we're sort of making a choice for them, if you get what I mean. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was veganism. And I don't know what is the presence of veganism in GU? Is there sort of like a minority of GU, or is it not something that really surfaces?
No, there's a lot of people who choose, not to engage in anything that deals with, the suffering of animals and its production, or, it's they don't eat meat, they don't use animal products in that way. And while I don't subscribe to the ideology of veganism, I, again, as a place of many different ideological perspectives, if a person is willing to communicate respectfully with the proper amount of tone and delivery and reverence for that other person's position, you can pitch whatever you want in GU. I mean, there's no rule saying you can't talk about this or you can't talk about that. One thing we have decided that we choose to heavily regulate is our conversations regarding mental health.
Right.
And the reason why is because, and I'm going to try not to get emotional when I say this with anger, but you got a lot of people out there who are like these armchair psychologists and armchair, uh, therapists, so to speak, and they've never had one stitch of education, one stitch of training, formal or otherwise, and they're trying to tell people about, what they should be doing with their depression. And I feel like it is so irresponsible to go into a place where people are psychologically and emotionally vulnerable and then muddy up the waters as to what the effective amount of treatment is based on their traumas. To me, it just is so arrogant and it's so much hubris that I just think it's a foul thing to do. And so that's one thing that, as when I sit in the chair, I do have the ability to make certain things into law. And that is something that I have, really tried to change within GU over the last couple of weeks, really, even now, is I don't believe that everyone should be able to give out mental health advice, because most people who don't go to any type of formal training for it think they know the most about it. And you just really get into some really destructive advice that's given from people who shouldn't be given it.
And what is your general opinion on veganism? Like, how do you view it? Because I don't know if you're aware, but there's a big overlap in terms of people, but it also, in my view, in terms of like the ideas themselves between veganism and antinatalism. There's a lot of people who sort of have a foot in both camps. And I can go into the reasons why I think that is later, but I wanted to hear, like, what's your general opinion on the
So
topic?
again, I think there's going to be people out there with a lot of different perspectives about life and what they want to do to mitigate suffering and a negative impact on the world. Again, if you are a person who wants to communicate that position with respect, I have no problem discussing it with you. Here's my issue with veganism, as well as any other isms out there. You are not going to proselytize to me. Okay. You are not going to shame me into your position. In fact, you're more likely to embolden me just to spite you when you do that. There is a very holier than thou perspective for people who claim to be vegan. No, you're not holier than me. You're not more righteous than me. You're just a person who's taking different actions. You still cause suffering. So fuck you. I don't care what you think. But if you want to have a regular conversation about your position on things, hey man, let's have a conversation. You want to tell me why factory farming is an immoral process? Show me. I have no problem with that. But if after you show me everything you show me, I tell you, okay, that's cool, I'm still going to eat meat. Your next thing, if you want to shame me, then our communication ends there. Because to me, I can shame everyone in the first world for paying for things that happen in the second and the third world. You can not deal with animal products all you want to. You're paying for those drones that are hitting those Palestinians. Even though you're out there with your sign and I stand with, no, your tax money is still paying for those drone strikes. So at the end of the day, you can try to be holier than thou and present yourself as if you're somewhat more righteous and lose the ability to communicate your position. Or you can say, hey, I have a position, and if anybody's open to hear it, I'm willing to tell them. Secondly, I think a lot of people have positions that people would be more interested in if people wanted to be more like them. Right? Example, I don't meet very many Christians that I want to be like. There's been a couple that I've met where like, yeah, man, I'd like to be like that dude. He's an upstanding dude. He takes care of his family. He's got a good business. He's got good stature. He dresses well. He's got good relationships. Like, I want to be like that guy. I don't care if he's a Christian or a Muslim. That doesn't bother me at all. I want to be like that guy, or I want to be like that girl. I want to be like that person because they are showing me aspects about their life that I would like to incorporate and assimilate into my life. But if I don't want to be like you, If you have an attitude and an aura I don't even want to be like, I don't give a fuck what you think about animal cruelty. I don't want to be like you. So if you're not eating animal products, I want to eat animal products. Why? Because I don't want to be like you. So from my perspective, if I want to be like you, I'm much more interested in what you have to say and what you are offering to me as some sort of an intellectual food than somebody I don't want to be like and someone I don't want to emulate in my life in terms of success and how I live my life. If that is the case, then you could tell me the sky is blue and I wouldn't care because you have nothing about your life that I want to be like. So in my opinion, if there were a lot more people with those positions that people wanted to be more like, and there are people out there who are cool and people want to be more like, totally fine. But if you just want to shame me for not thinking the way you do, then you can just save the bullshit and shame me because I'm not going to care. Your opinion of me means nothing when it comes to, well, he doesn't like this, or I don't like the fact that he eats meat. Like, okay, well, I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's unfortunate because vegans are still in every country a small minority, and so it's easy when there's a minority in a country that, because they're a minority, a lot of people may not come into contact with them, or at least reasonable members of that minority. It's easy to take the polarizing and extreme versions of those people and put them in the media. And so I think this is one of the places that this, I guess, like this annoying or self-righteous sort of view of vegans has come from. But it also has been that there has been in the forms of like activism that a lot of vegans do, like going out on the streets and talking to people and showing slaughterhouse footage. I don't know if you've seen these sorts of things online or in person.
I've watched everything from slaughterhouse footage to regular human slaughterhouse footage. So
so that's a form of activism that is prone to conflict, whereas conflict between individuals and it getting inflamed and heated, if you get what I mean. And so I think those things have meant that vegans have, as people, rather than the ideas, but as people, have gained quite a bad reputation in the eyes of many, which I hope over time will get better, because I think the ideas behind veganism and, having a compassionate sort of approach to our interactions with animals, rather than sort of generally, as our society does, seeing them as resources, more seeing them as, essentially like moral patients, because essentially they are sort of like, mentally they're like very young children. They don't fully understand the environments they're in. We are much more intelligent than them, at least in a lot of ways. There are some ways that they're more intelligent than us.
I was going to say, I disagree with the premise that they're not aware. I think there's a lot of evidence to not agree with you on that.
No, true. So when I say aware, I mean of sort of the larger scale stuff. Like humans are aware of things like a religion or an economy or public policy and politics and stuff like that. Animals aren't aware of that, but I do get what you mean. I think they are aware in ways that people underestimate them. I think that they're much more emotionally intelligent than people give them credit for, and just generally intelligent in terms of problem solving. But I also think they're much more prone to suffering than a lot of people think as well. Because I think a lot of people just dismiss their suffering out of hand, viewing them as like biological machines or something like that. But I wanted to get what you think of veganism in terms of the ideas rather than the people. What do you think about the ideas behind veganism, of that we shouldn't be using animals as resources to our benefit, and we should be seeing them as moral patients whom we care for, rather than use because we will benefit from it in terms of eating meat or experimentation for cosmetics and stuff like that?
I think so. I have to separate big V from little v veganism, because I feel like little v veganism deals more with a person's personal perspective of how they implement their own veganism, as opposed to general accepted consensus ideas about veganism itself. But I do have to kind of go back to this point, which is, are we animals?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Biologically, yeah.
If we are biologically animals and we recognize that there are other animals in the animal kingdom that cause suffering in order to eat and survive, again, if you can have your own individual ideas about the morality in that. But again, nature doesn't really care how you survive, only that you do. Until some moral arbitrator comes down and says to all of us at the same time, hey, eating these animals are bad, it's still a perspective of a person. Again, I happen to be much more of a moral relativist. There are certain things I'm not relative about, but for the most part, I tend to be a moral relativist because I don't believe that we have a complete, absolute understanding of morality. And what we think is right and wrong has all been programmed and baked into the cultural, evolutionary, physiological pie that we depend on this world for survival. And so maybe it's not the fish you eat. Maybe it's the microbes you destroy every time you walk every day. Are we going to prevent those? What about the bacteria we kill? What about the fungus we kill? What about all these other things that don't look all cute? Yeah, the little bunny you shouldn't eat because it looks cute. I feel for the bunny. Okay, that's cool. But there are other living organisms out there that we destroy every day whenever we do anything. And again, if I'm going to feel one way for the fish or the cow or whatever it is we're talking about that we shouldn't be eating, then unless you're telling me that the microbial life doesn't mean as much as the fish life, then we have a totally different conversation to have. Now, I am an animal in nature. I happen to live in an island of society that has all these cultural things that we got programmed and, we tell each other that makes us feel good. But you remove society. If you throw human beings into the ocean of nature, all of the ideas about veganism go out the window, and it's about survival. If I set a trap and I'm really hungry, I haven't eaten for a week, and I set a trap and there's a bunny that goes into the trap, do you think I care that it's a bunny? No, I don't care. And it sounds good on paper that I do because it makes me look more virtuous and moral as a human being, but that's only because I'm trying to separate myself from the animal kingdom. And the harsh reality that comes with that. There's an incredible, brutal reality that comes with being in wild nature. Saw a video today. Pack of wild dogs tear this antelope while it's living apart. So let's say we stomp out all of the humans inflicting that on animals. Are we going to go police the animal kingdom now? No, we're not. It's something we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel good, and that's great. But it has no bearing in nature.
So I agree with you that if we were in a completely different situation than we are now, when we're in more of like a survival situation where we're in nature, a lot of the rules can go out the window. But I think that the situation that we're in can change the moral decisions that we make. So if I'm in a situation where it's a survival situation, it's me or the rabbit or the pig or the dog or whatever, then I don't know. I actually don't know what choice I would make in that moment. I don't know if I would be able to bring myself to kill that animal, but I know that the situation I'm in now, I don't have to make that decision, if you get what I mean. And I also recognize that nature is brutal and animals rip each other apart in it, but I don't think that gives us any form of like get out of not get out of jail free card, but I don't think that gives us a reason to inflict more suffering on animals who wouldn't even exist, if you get what I mean. Because the animals in farms, we don't take them from nature where they would have died anyway. We just create them out of essentially nothing. We breed them ourselves. And then they, by and large, like 95 to 99% of them have awful lives. And then we kill them often in brutal ways. And to me, that is completely disconnected from nature. I agree. Nature is brutal as well, and I actually do stuff in my personal life to try and alleviate the suffering of wild animals, because I do care about that issue as well. But I think the systematic breeding of animals by humans for our benefit, it reminds me of Omelas. The animals are essentially the kid in the basement, and we are all the people living in Omelas. But in the real world, Omelas isn't an amazing city where everyone's having amazing lives. We're all having average lives or shit lives, but there are still all those animals in the basement, if you get what I mean. And it's not just one of them; it's millions and millions.
Okay. So I have a couple questions for you.
Yeah, go for it.
Say all that what you said is just true. Everything
Mm.
you said is true. And I'm not disputing whether it is or not. I'm just framing it with the fact that I'm accepting what you're saying is true.
Yeah.
To whom do I sit in judgment? Front of?
I agree with you. I don't think morals are ultimately objective. I think.
Well, hold on. I guess I'm asking a more direct question.
Oh,
so,
right. Okay.
Who is going to judge me immoral that I chose to kill the animal to survive? Is it the vegan or the regular human, or the person the non-vegan, the carnivore?
It could be both. It would depend on the situation. So, for example, if you were, say, in America as you are now, if you chose to kill and eat a dog, I think everyone around you would probably sit in judgment. But if you chose to kill a pig, it would probably only be the vegan or the vegetarian, if you get what I mean.
That's totally fine, and I'm not arguing with you when it comes to degrees or dimensions of this, right? I'm simply saying that if those who are going to judge me are as flawed as I am, that's an easy way for me to compartmentalize what I'm doing as a human being. Again,
Yes.
I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I also don't operate off of another person's morality place. So you can tell me, again, I said this before, you can tell me all day wrong, like you think it's wrong. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with you being able to tell me that. But who's going to hold me accountable for doing it?
No one. I think it's upon ourselves to, well, I mean, obviously the law can get involved if something's illegal, but in this case, it's not illegal, obviously.
So unless it is cultural, where the culture decides it is wrong to eat a dog, like you said, but it's not wrong to eat a cow. Yeah. Whereas in India, it is wrong to eat a cow, but not wrong to eat a dog. Right? There are places where in that culture, it is okay to eat fish, but not okay to eat this. In certain Islamic cultures, they don't eat certain, pork and pigs and stuff like that, but they'll eat other things.
Yeah.
One other thing that I get confused about when it comes to veganism, when it comes to the suffering of animals and stuff like that, is this concept of quantifying value of life in one species or another. If I go and whack a bunch of, plants and kill a bunch of plants that are living beings, whether you think they're sentient or not is besides the point. The bar is living or not. If I'm cutting these beings or if I'm slashing these beings in order to make my meal, am I not causing suffering in that way, even though I tried to mitigate it from the animals that I possibly would have eaten as well?
I don't think so, because I think suffering is something that, whilst we don't fully understand, humans, we understand that humans suffer because we have a central nervous system, nociception, a brain, and we share these with pigs, cows, chickens, dogs, etc. But whilst plants are very intelligent and we don't fully understand them yet, I haven't
then
seen.
How do we hold on? I got it because I got to be honest with you. What you're saying to me sounds very rehearsed, right?
Yeah, I've been vegan for like over 6 years, so I've spoken to a lot of people about this. Yeah,
no, and I totally understand that. But what I'm trying to say is that we don't know if these plants are experiencing an amount of suffering or not. And whether we think that suffering is just tied to a central nervous system, we have no way to know for sure. So that's my point. All of this to me is a type of, I'm not going to be too sharp with my words here, but
Mm.
it sounds like a human trying to make itself feel better about the amount of suffering that it engages in order to just live. And I get why that is the case, but I also don't feel the same way.
No, I get what you mean. And I didn't, just to be open, I didn't approach this conversation trying to change your mind or anything. I just wanted to explore it with you. But I understand what you mean in terms of, and I agree, we don't fully understand plants and the capacities they have yet. But I think if we can live in a way where we kill plants who we don't know whether they feel pain or not yet, and animals which we do know they feel pain, or we could just live on plants, it seems to me the logical choice to only consume plants and as much as we can in a reasonable degree avoid harming animals. Because like we know like pigs, cows, chickens have central nervous systems, but plants, we don't know if they can suffer, and it doesn't seem to even make evolutionary sense for them to suffer, because like I said before, suffering, it's an information system in many ways. That's why it evolved. It was, here's a negative stimuli to tell you not to do that, and so you remove yourself from the situation. But a tree or a blade of grass can't move, so it wouldn't really make much evolutionary sense for them to develop suffering, because they can't move away from the thing that the suffering would tell them to move away from, if you get what I mean.
I do, but it still moves the goalposts away from the bar of life. We are still talking about living creatures, correct?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I don't, well, personally, I don't think life has inherent moral value. I think sentient life, and when I say sentient life, I basically mean life that can suffer, which is why I have a problem with, that's why I'm antinatalist. I don't want to create a new human who can suffer, but I don't mind planting flowers in the garden, if you get what I mean. Because even though that's life, I don't have any. Oh, sorry.
But hold on. I guess I have to ask this question. Are there animals that eat plants?
Yes, yeah.
Hold on. Are there animals that eat plants while they're rooted into the ground? How do we?
The plants are rooted into the ground. Yeah.
That's what I mean. How do we know that the plant is not feeling some sort of pain and discomfort while it is alive being eaten?
No, we don't. But I think there are good reasons to think that they wouldn't. One, like I just said before, it wouldn't really make evolutionary sense. But also, you have many examples of plants that have evolved to be eaten, like fruits, right? That's how they disperse their seeds. It wouldn't make sense to evolve to be eaten and also evolve for that process that you need to be extremely painful, if you get what I mean. I don't see why those two things would evolve in tandem.
I think, again, this is very much in my perspective, from my opinion. I'm not dismissing yours, but this is very much more of a cultural thing, because the morals and the concepts of what is right and wrong and what is valuable and what is not, and who is valuable and how much life is necessary for it to be considered valuable life. I don't really think of it in terms of sentient life, non-sentient life. I think of it in terms of life. And yes, you can get me to try to see things from your perspective, but I'm not going to, because it's just life. And all life deserves to be here. And if it doesn't, then ultimately we all make our choices as to which life we snuff out. There are times where I see a fly or something like trying to, mess with me, and I'll instinctively, not even thinking about it, I'll kind of swat at the fly. And then I'll be like, oh, wait, no, that's a life. Like, what if I just try to let it out, right? Try to let it out the house. And there are some times where I'll try to do that. There are other times where I feel something on my neck. I slap my neck. Oh, there was a bug there. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
Now, everybody's going to feel differently about that action. Some people are going to think that's murder. Some people are going to think that's inconsequential. My question is, who do I sit in judgment before? And if those people aren't people in a culture that I want to be like, it's going to be really hard to change my decision. Because from my perspective, if we have to fight, these particular groups of people versus other groups of people, and one group knows it has a physiological advantage from eating meat and the other group just culturally doesn't because they feel a certain way about it, and these two sides meet in war, it'd be really interesting to see the results. But I'm assuming there's going to be some sort of an evolutionary advantage to something we grew up, as a species eating on.
Yeah, I think, and we can move we can move on after this, but
we don't have to. I'm enjoying this. I think this is fascinating.
Okay, good. Okay.
I do have a hard out at 2:55. Sorry.
How long away is that? Because I'm not in your same time.
That is 20 minutes.
Okay, 20 minutes.
Yep.
So I just want to quickly touch on that civil war, which I think if there is a civil war, it's not going to be along meat eater vegan lines, but we can, we can what's it called? We can think about it anyway.
And I would love, before you go there, I would love to have a whole conversation with you about this. If you ever want to do another show and we just talk specifically about this, I think both of us have ideas that in a public forum should be discussed.
Yeah. You mean about veganism or the veganism meat eater civil war?
No. Well, the vegan meat eater civil war would probably be two really small camps anyway, because I don't know any meat eater who's going to go to war for their meat eating, but
Yeah. No. I'd love to. So if that's something you want to do at a later date, we can definitely do that. Because I would love to speak more about that. But anyway, so we can leave the civil war thing. I was gonna
let's go civil war. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so the only thing I was going to say, and I'm not saying this in a serious way or anything, but obviously in the current day, vegans would clearly lose because there are just so much less of them than people who eat meat or are like a non-vegan, basically. But say we had two camps, equally, equal in numbers of vegans and meat eaters. It's not clear to me who would win because, like many of the modern diseases we have are caused by, at least seem to me, caused by overconsumption of animal products, like heart disease and many cancers are associated with increased dairy consumption and meat eater consumption. So I think the meat eater lines would, would get thinned out even before we came to blows,
Interesting. I have a question for you regarding that. Let's assume that the meat eaters would kind of self-inflictedly remove themselves from the chessboard.
Yeah.
You're telling me that a war between people who have no problem eating animals and the suffering that comes with that versus people who the idea of killing anything is antithetical to their very core. So you can kill me in defense of the animal, but I can't kill the animal in survival of myself?
Yeah. So I reckon what the vegans will have is obviously in their, like, the helmets they're wearing. Usually in like World War II, they'd all have a picture of their like wife and kids. Vegans would have like little pictures of animals at animal sanctuaries or whatever, remembering what they're fighting for, and I think that would be pretty motivating.
If you're fighting against someone who has that in their in their Kevlar helmet, the animals and trees and stuff, fighting against someone who's fighting for their family, their wife and kid.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Good luck with that.
Well, I don't know. Obviously, vegans, they have, wives and kids as well. But so they've got a whole that, they're not fighting just for their wife and kids, but they've got a whole other species they've got to, stick up for. Jokes aside anyway. But no, I'd love to have another conversation with you about that, any time.
We should call that episode The Meat Eater Vegan Civil War. I think that would be fantastic to explore.
Yeah. Okay, we can do that. So I wanted to finish on like just asking you, I heard you mention I think you mentioned it in a stream the other day, you're working on a new album.
I am.
So what sort of ideas are you exploring in that, and just how's it going in general?
Well, I may actually do a song about veganism now that you've kind of brought that up. I think it would be an interesting thing to explore from my perspective, but also have an MC probably on the track who's a vegan who can argue from his particular perspective as well. Yeah. I think it'd be interesting. I think hip hop is something that I've learned to be really, really good at. And I like writing songs that articulate very complex concepts. And this album will be no different because it is the second in a series of 4 albums. And the album itself is a fourth in a quadrilogy of albums known as the Kardashev scale. And
Yeah.
so, I did the Kardashev scale. I did type 2, the Mandelbrot set. I did type 3, Omniverse.
Yep.
And I started doing type 4. And the first album for type 4 was called City on the Type of Forever. The second album is called Last of the Rhyme Lords, almost like a play on Doctor Who Time Lords. So I did
Yeah.
Last of the Rhyme Lords for that one. The third album is called Tour of the Orphan Knight, which is a chess reference. And the final album is called Iron Star Era. And these 4 albums collectively make type 4, the album. But I wanted to release them separately because each album has 16 songs and, there's 64 spaces on the chessboard. So if you add all of those up, it equals out into 64 songs, one representing each space on the chessboard. So there's a lot of complexities in the album that I'm working on. But the current one I'm working on is Last of the Rhyme Lords. And the concepts are, I talked a lot about artificial intelligence and, the singularity. In my last album, I spoke a lot about the singularity, the simulation argument. I talked a lot about, a lot of my personal issues and my development at this point. But on this new album, I would like to explore other concepts that are fringe and fantastic, but probably not as well known right now. The thing about this album, I will say this, is it's less of a concept album than any of my other albums before, because I've done really nothing but concept albums from the moment I got into the rap industry. The reason why this is not so much of a concept album is because as an MC, I really wanted to just flex my lyrical acumen. I like rhyming. I really do. And I like playing with phonetic. I'm actually teaching a course right now on my Discord, cheap plug, called Phonetic Rhyme Theory. And I talk about the concepts of rhyming sounds and how to articulate what you're trying to rap about through this method of, phonetic rhyme theory. And so my students go through this kind of course of understanding how to write rhymes with their ears and not with their eyes. You get a lot of white belts who they write rhymes with their eyes, and then they will read them, and that is processed into a particular sound that doesn't really rhyme. They're just words that are spelled similar. When I teach my students to rhyme, they rhyme based off of their ears and the sounds that these words make phonetically. So there's so much more to play with lyrically than just a person who is writing words that are spelled very similar. And I think Last of the Rhyme Lords as an album comes at the perfect time, because as a teacher, I feel like I am at the top of my game in my understanding of the craft. So writing ill lyrics that are, obviously use some high concepts and stuff like that. I feel like writing those type of songs from this perspective is something that I want to do, just to show people like I'm a lyrical monster. I can write about anything at any time on any day. And on this album, I want to just show people how really, really good I am, as opposed to talking about deep concepts, multiverses and alien species and, those sort of things, which is great. And there's 7 albums that I've made that if you guys want to check those out, that would be fantastic for you to check them out. But I think this album, particularly because it's called Last of the Rhyme Lords, is something that I wanted to show, hey, I'm doing songs with these really all-time rap dudes, and I'm able to hold my own. These are some of the legends in the game that I'm having on this album. And I want my lyrical acumen to be comparable to theirs. And so that's what the new album is kind of about, Last of the Rhyme Lords. And then Tour of the Orphan Knight is much more personal about, kind of my journey emotionally from there to here. And then Iron Star Era close out the whole series. So,
yeah, it reminds me of your song Ascension, where you kind of talk about, or you I don't know if you envisage it as like a dream, or you just paint this story about, you being up in front of these legends basically and judging whether you have served hip hop well, and they send you back so that you can really prove yourself.
Mhm.
And the way that you described this new album, kind of, it reminded me of, in that song, you being sent back so you can really prove yourself, and your sort of like competency as an MC. I don't know if I'm making an unjust link there.
No, no, you are. And I always get emotional when someone brings that song up because I wrote that song about someone who passed away in
Yeah.
my life who, she was responsible for me becoming Greydon Square. And, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be who I am today. And
Mm,
she taught me a lot about being an artist and presenting myself as such, uh, when I didn't believe in that myself.
mm,
And, it's just crazy to think about that song because if you ask anybody what my favorite song of all time that I ever wrote is, it's that one. And that's because it
mm,
was a dedication to her and what I thought maybe a potential afterlife would be if my art was put on trial.
mm.
And this concept of it's funny, I had name dropped an actress that I used to date on that song. Very few people catch that. But there's there's a nice little name drop. But I'm actually writing a sequel to that song.
Oh, nice. Because,
I
like,
am.
honestly, and this is completely honest. This is not me trying to, play up to you or anything.
No,
I listen to that song all the time. I love that song. So I am here for a sequel to that, and I'm here for the new album.
thank you.
Honestly, I think Ascension is a masterpiece. I think it's
Wow.
like a really impressive song. I love it.
Thank you so
Um,
much. I just got to say this thing about that. Like the fact that no one's ever really told me that, to be honest with you. No one's ever really told me that Ascension is a masterpiece. And,
mm,
I got to be honest with you. Like that hits me in the feels
mm,
because I think that's the first time anyone's ever really told me that that song is as special as I believe that song to be. I believe that
mm,
is the greatest song I ever wrote, the greatest song I ever will write. And it was driven by someone who really cared about my success as an artist. And I try to work every day to honor that belief in me that she had.
yeah. Yeah, like I said, I think that song's amazing, and I'll actually link that song in the description specifically so people can go check it out and know what we're talking about. But yeah, I'm excited to hear about the new album, and also the sequel of Ascension.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and discussing all the things we discussed with me.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, listeners, whether they be, from your audience or mine, I'm sure they're not going to agree with everything that they've heard. But I think one
Mm,
thing that they will appreciate is the fact that we are two people with two different perspectives and some overlap, but
mm,
we're able to have a conversation without calling each other a bigot or a
yeah,
Nazi or a this or a that. And at the end of the day, regardless of if I agree with you on everything, I just respect you enough to hear out what you have to say. Whether I agree
mm,
with it or not, that's totally different. But if you feel like you want to present to me something, I will sit down, shut up, and listen to you while you present it. And
mm,
if you're willing to hear my critique on it, that's fine. If not, that's fine too. But I just appreciate your willingness to have a conversation with me, just an open-ended conversation with me in front of, all the fans and all the audience, because so many times people will do videos about people and there's no line of communication there. And, I hope people understand that, most people just want to talk
yeah.
and are open to be presented with new information about a particular way that they think that could change their mind.
Yeah, no, 100% agreed. And yeah, thank you again just for coming on and giving me your time as well, because we've been going for quite a while.
Yeah, man. No, you're easy to talk to. I think you've got a good thing going. I watched some of your other videos. Your production style is quality. I think your editing is great. You got a really good thing going, bro.
Oh no, thank you. That means a lot. Yeah, so thank you so much, and it's been great talking to you.
Absolutely. Don't forget to check out GreydonSquare.shop, GreydonSquare.com, Discord.gg/Grand Unified. Follow me on
Yeah.
Instagram. Oh, you guys know.